And hopefully everybody had an opportunity to see the intro that Cale put together. It tried to set the stage for what we were trying to do with Answers for Chris, but in a nutshell, the idea that Mike and I had about this class came out of a personal experience some 13 years ago when I was teaching a college Bible study class. And at that time, a young man approached me named Chris, and he said, I've been raised in an atheistic background, and as far as I can tell, I've been an atheist all my life, but now I am thinking about becoming a Christian. I'm exploring Christianity, and I think I'm becoming a Christian, is what he told me. But I have these questions. And they were very familiar questions. They were questions straight out of the Freethinker forums in Colorado Springs and like places. And many of those questions I just regurgitated and put in word for word in the video, in the intro video, if you saw that. And I also added a few others, because as I go through and you look at any time that CNN has a religion blog, and you look at all the comments that follow and all the objections and the critiques and, you know, kind of the snarky comments that follow, there's a common theme. And if you go to the next chart, Rick, the common themes are the things that we're trying to illustrate in this class. Now, I'm not going to pretend that we're going to hit all of them, or we're going to hit all of them to the level of detail, which is going to make us all experts, but hopefully, after we are done here, we will have a better understanding today about what Chris's world looks like. Next week, we will at least be able to articulate a Christian defense in terms of questions about God and suffering and pain. You know, the age-old question, if God is good, why did he allow so much evil and suffering and pain and tragedy to happen in the world? The week following, we will talk about Christian exclusivity. Who are you? Who do you Christians think you are to be so judgmental? To think that you have a corner on truth? To believe that truth claims are uniquely to you in a pluralistic society? Who do you think you are? And also judgment in hell. A good God, a loving God, a kind and compassionate God. How could he possibly ever send anybody to hell, to an eternal damnation? Lesson 4, we'll talk about genocide. You see a lot about that. Go back to the Old Testament and the commands that God gives with regard to wiping out peoples in battle. And people like to go to that and talk about genocide being commanded by this all-loving, all-good God. How can that be? As well as slavery, which a lot of times people like to talk about or ask about slavery being endorsed, being commanded in the Scriptures, and how do you reconcile slavery in the context of the Scripture. Sexism and homosexuality. I don't think anybody needs to be told that this is a huge topic in our modern culture. How the Bible, how Christianity deals with women in a patriarchal society, misogynistic society, or worldview. And obviously the most relevant cultural issue of the day with regard to the way in which gays and lesbians are handled, and how the Bible treats that, and how Christians and the Christian church handles homosexuality. You know, you're going to be hard-pressed to have any conversation with someone who is questioning or skeptical and that topic not come up, candidly, right? You cannot have a class like this and not talk about the Bible and science. Hasn't science disproved the Bible? Hasn't it made it irrelevant, obsolete? You know, how do you reconcile your beliefs in the Bible? And then finally, superstition, mythology, and we have a wrap-up with the messenger and the message and the messenger. And this basically is the question, you know, if God really wanted everybody to believe in him, wouldn't he use something that's a little bit more relevant than kind of an archaic book and a bunch of people talking about it? Wouldn't he send miracles and divine things that would get everybody's attention, and, you know, it would be much easier if he wanted to get the message out, right? So we're going to talk about that. So hopefully we will hit a landscape of common questions and objections, at least to the point where we are conversational with Chris. So I think hopefully everybody got a chance to see the video, but if you didn't, we took Chris, a real-life college student, and we kind of used him as an everyman. And Chris was a good name, because it could be Christopher, it could be Christine, Christina. We use Chris to represent everyman. Now, we know that threads, themes that we need to understand as we develop relationships. But we can make some general observations about the world that Chris lives in and about the kinds of views and values that Chris may very well have. And so, whatever percent you want, 80%, 85%, we will see that this world that Chris lives in is a world that we are also very familiar with. Because Chris is not only out there, right? Chris is here. I suspect if we are thinking, hopefully, even partially thinking Christians, we have asked ourselves questions like this. Does God really send somebody to hell forever and ever and ever? That sounds good, right? And as we think about these kinds of things, even if we believe we've got all the quote-unquote answers in the room, what about our children? I have an opportunity, having been in the church for a little while in Colorado Springs, back when my kids were, or back when I had friends, children who are my kids' age now, and they're posting in Facebooks. And I read a lot of the things that they're posting, and many of them are professing Christians. And they are posting the same kinds of messages that we were going to hear Chris asking about or poking at. It is not exempt from the church, the ideas and the views and the values that we're going to talk about in this class. So I think it's very important, and I appreciate your time. And let's move into Chris's world. Trying to articulate a view of the world that we live in is, as some people have said, something like asking a fish about water. You know what I mean? The fish doesn't know anything but water. That's all the fish knows. And so sometimes stepping back, even as Christians, it's hard for us to step back and look at the culture and the world that Chris lives in is permeated with, has been thinking about all of his or her life and what that looks like. And so I wrote down some ideas that I had, and then I went in and listed some websites like the Western Culture, globalculture.org, and other areas of thought. And I tried to put together what I believe to be a reasonably comprehensive list of what I think Chris's world looks like today. Now, a lot of times we use the term worldview. That's a popular term. Francis Schaeffer, others over the years, worldview. You hear that a lot in Christian circles. Less so in Chris's world. And I'm going to try to refrain as much as possible from using terms that Chris doesn't understand or may not make sense. Worldview is okay. Apologetics is okay. But we'll use the word answers or defenses. We'll just follow Peter's direction that we always be prepared to give an answer. The word he uses, at least in English, is answer or an account for the hope that we have in Christ, and doing it with gentleness and respect. So we'll just talk about Chris's values, his value set. What Chris thinks about and how he views the world that he lives in, or she lives in today. First of all, Chris lives in a world steeped in individualism and pluralism. All right? And let me also caveat by saying this is not a critique necessarily of Chris's world. Many of these values we're going to talk about, and I'm going to elaborate on this later on, are values we share. We share them along with Chris because, like Chris, we are in the image of God. We are image bearers. But there are going to be some areas where obviously we have strong disagreements or disconnects. So this is not a critique. This is not me saying all this stuff is bad. What it is me saying is this is kind of the macrocosm, if you will, of the world that Chris is used to. These are the things that he or she is hearing when he or she talks to her family, or talks to her friends, or talks to her teachers, or hears what the media has to say. So going back, individualism. We live in a very privatized world, right? We password protect everything. We have our security systems. We've got our fences. We've got everything very privatized. We like our personal space. And if you listen to the way in which life is marketed to us, everything is personalized, right? We personalize everything down to the firmness on our mattresses, right? To every way in which you can organize apps on your mobile device, to your entire life is privatized and personalized, highly individualistic, okay? Although there's community and there's certainly communal things, individualism is premier. There's also, not surprisingly, a growing distrust, we've seen it certainly over the last 50 years, of authority and hierarchy. Political authority, religious authority, hierarchy, those, in Chris's view, are treated very suspiciously. The institution of the church, the organized church, clearly government, leaders, viewed very suspiciously. First of all, because they are hierarchical and tend not to be as pluralistic or as egalitarian. But second of all, because in many cases, leaders have earned our distrust over the last 50 years, particularly. We have battle scars and wounds on both sides of the aisle from leaders that have not upheld what they said they would, and therefore there's just this collective distrust. Preeminence of individual choice and opinion, lending itself to a pluralistic view. You know what I mean? Pluralism. It is the mantra that ideas, no one has a foothold, or no one has an absolute statement that their views or their opinions matter more than anyone else's. Pluralism, individual choice, my right to be able to do what I want to do, as long as it doesn't hurt someone else. Opinions, my opinion is as valid as Mike's opinion. Mike may have Jesus, I may have crystals. It's the same, it's equivalent, and we'll talk more about that in a bit. Happiness. Life's ultimate objective in Chris's world is happiness. We define it in different ways, and many of these things we relate to: love and success and purpose, relationships, fulfillment. There's a lot of different ways in which Chris pursues happiness. This is an entry point, by the way, into Chris's world. But happiness is what, you ask a person on the street, what is it that you're looking for? We want to be happy. We're pursuing happiness, in whatever form that happens to look like. Universal human rights and freedoms. Freedoms to be able to do our sexuality, how we choose to do our sexuality. Freedoms in every way with regard to civil rights, national origin, color, religion, language, sexual orientation. These basic freedoms. And let me emphasize in foot stomp what the title says. Chris's world assumes societal evolution. If you listen to the mantra, you listen to what the culture is saying, there is a common theme, which is we are evolving as a people, right? We're evolving as a people. We're evolving as a society. It's very Star Trek-ish, Gene Roddenberry-ish, that we are getting, we've gone past all of that kind of evil, rotten, cruddy stuff that we used to be into a higher plane of societal evolution. And one of the key ways in which we view ourselves doing this is through the evolution of rights, starting with women's suffrage, moving to the civil rights movement, moving to gay rights. People in Chris's world see that as a natural progression, okay? And to say that there should be a limitation or restriction is fundamentally unfair to people in Chris's world. It seems restrictive, prohibitive, unfair, mean, right? And you see why there is such a visceral reaction in Chris's world to some of the things that we Christians stand for. So, I will talk later about whether I believe this to be true or not. Tip my hand, I don't, right? The reason why we believe largely in this idea of societal evolution is because we have coupled technological advance with societal advance. We have assumed that because we have much more control and capability over the physical universe, and we understand it, and we can mold it, and we can make it do what we want it to do, then that natural technological evolution translates to human evolution, to societal evolution. And in some regards, we would say there's been progress, and in some regards, we would say there's not, but that coupling is not a proper, in my view, linkage. Capitalism, the Human Rights Organization, the Western Global Culture, talks about capitalism, and certainly I think most people generally agree with free markets, but I have said that that needs to be in tension with an intrinsic egalitarianism, if you know what I mean by that. This idea that the 1%, and you saw it with the 1%, right? This idea that these capitalistic, people who greedy, take everything, the rich get richer, the poor get poorer, and everybody else is stuck in between. You hear that quite a bit. And so although we kind of like our capitalism, we're also very suspicious, going back to that, that individualism and pluralism, we're very suspicious of those rich CEOs who take, make themselves richer, and we get poorer, right? You hear that. Science and technology, huge in Chris's world, right? Huge in Chris's world, science and technology. Science, obviously our command, our ability to be able to harness nature and translate it into something, a tool set for us to be able to use in the context of resolving societal obstacles, getting past a lot of the things that have been barriers to us in the past, improving our quality of life. Much of this, by the way, is true, okay? But science is viewed, technology is viewed as in many regards, in Chris's world, as a savior, right? Reason. Now, we can debate how rational people we really are, but we in our culture think we're very rational people. We want data. If I'm ever in a boardroom and we're talking about planning, whatever, my bosses want data. We want to be able to look through and reasonably articulate a path based on data. We are logical, reason-driven people. We're not these, people who believe in fairy tales and pixie dust. We're rational. We make our decisions concretely, and our critical thinking based on material data and on evidence. We want evidence. Okay, that's what speaks to our culture. Now again, this is not a critique on these things. Many of these things, I think, if we went around the room, we'd ask ourselves, and we kind of argue it and say it. And we'd say, yeah, there is a confluence. But there's also some areas where we've got boundaries, and this is what we're going to work through in terms of answers for Chris. So what I'm going to do as our breakout session at this point is stop videoing, and I'm going to ask the tables to spend 5 minutes just... Let me address a couple of things. There are excellent points that were made by the group, so what I would consider misses. We talked about, where does materialism fit in this? We're going to talk about truth in a moment. 2 questions that I'll try to address very briefly in about 15 minutes on capitalism and how that fits what I meant by the capitalism, egalitarianism tension, and then also the spiritual basis of where Chris is coming from. And then a couple of excellent points in terms of where Chris is coming from in terms of his family construct, and also where Chris's education, what level of education Chris has attained, will greatly change the view that Chris may have in terms of culture. On the relational side, or I should say on the where do we get our values, which actually was something that I really wanted to drive home, but I think we got to it. Family came up several times. The Christian journey, certainly for folks in the room, friends, and media, particularly reading. And I want to emphasize one aspect of it. I hope that this would be the answer, but I wasn't for sure. I figured it would. Is that most of Chris and our views and values come relationally. Now, that's not to say that there's not a significant amount of data that Chris takes in on a daily basis based on opinions from people that Chris may not know very well. But Chris still is greatly impacted, to Scott's point about the family piece, by family, by teachers, by friends, by colleagues, by people in Chris's life. And so a point of connection with regard to any time that we're going to be dealing with Chris, obviously, is relational. Now, the real Chris, the real guy, I answered all of his questions. He went somewhere. I have no idea where Chris is today. And I look back on the experience and I was like, I really should have invested more in Chris than just the answers. So that was a lesson learned for me, is the relational aspect. Let me touch very briefly on what I meant, and this is just Wayne's opinion. It's not necessarily better than anyone else's in the room. My observation with regard to capitalism and egalitarianism. Capitalism as an economic construct, I think, is generally accepted within Western culture, with modification. But I think what I was trying to draw out with regard to the egalitarian point of view is particularly within younger subcultures. There is a sense of unfairness that the capital structure enables. And I, as a Christian, would say that it's not the capital structure as much as it is those who may be participating in it once you get to a point. But there's a sense in which younger generations particularly look at folks who are in the 1%, I just pick the 1% and say, no one should see that kind of wage inequality. You know what I mean? You hear that. That's what I was trying to touch on. There should not be. There's no one in the world who works so hard as to have a wage inequality differentiating the CEO from the person who's doing tech work in the plant. That was what I was trying to drive out with regard to the tension of egalitarianism. We all should be a whole lot more close in terms of our economic means and position than our society necessarily has enabled. And also was asked about spiritual. Well, we could spend a whole class, right, on versus spirituality. But I would say eclectic. We don't mind being a spiritual people. We talk a lot about that. We're spiritual people. But Chris tends, at least my observation of Chris tends to be very suspicious of non-hostile and organized religion because of the hierarchy. And very highly coupled to the individual choice of religious perspective. And we're going to get into this, the issue of truth in a moment. The whole idea that since I basically define truth, or I get to choose from the cafeteria of options that are available to me, my choice, and I'm just stealing from Gene Veith's, I think he uses Charles Colson in postmodern times as an example of dialogue that Colson was having with a colleague trying to talk about Jesus, and the colleague said, well, you have Jesus, I have crystals. Your Jesus does for you what crystals do for me. Same. You take vanilla, I take chocolate, right? So a very eclectic and very, I will say, pluralistic view of religion and spirituality. Basically, at the end of the day, we choose our spirituality, and in many respects, it all gets ultimately unfiltered to the same place anyway. Very tightly coupled, in my opinion, to happiness. What works for you? What brand of spirituality works for you? If it works for you, it's good. Do it. Run with it. If it doesn't work for you, go do something else. It was like a Don Imus, I think, one time I heard him say, what I'm going to do is it was on the topic of prayer, he says, I'm going to try praying one time to see if I get what I want. And if it doesn't happen, then I'm not doing it anymore. Right? And then he was being a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but there is a sense in which we find the religious basis for what works. It's a highly individualistic position. There is no absolute sense of one being better than the other. And we find what works in Christmas world. That's Wayne's opinion, for what it's worth. So let me move to the next chart. We've got a couple left, and I have about 12 minutes to get through it. I promise that we have Q&A time. Let me say, I think everybody probably would agree with this, that everything that Chris's world, and our world for that matter, is processed through the lens of what I call his core values. Some people would call it worldview. Now, we've foot-stomped this many, many times in Christian circles. But when we talk to Chris, chances are that Chris very well may say, I deal in data, facts, the hard evidence, okay? Just the facts, ma'am, kind of perspective. I'll let the facts speak for themselves, or I will decide. Now, if you think about that for a moment, we realize that falls apart pretty quickly. What was the trial in Sanford? I can't believe I can't remember. The Zimmerman trial, right? It was the biggest thing in 2013. Okay, Trayvon Martin. And here you have the same body of evidence, the same people, everybody's hearing the same people get up and talk, the same explanations, the same data, if you will, that's being presented to a mass of people with violently different opinions about how they interpret that data, right? Depending on their value set, depending on where they come from, depending on their perspective. Well, we believe this person, well, we don't believe this person. We accept this set of facts, but we don't accept this set of facts. How could you come to such a violently different set of opinions as our culture did on that one specific case with essentially the same data? It's because we process data through the lens of our views and value sets, right? And I think any honest, objective, question and answer with Chris would get Chris to admit, as Cornelius Van Til said, the presuppositions, the assumptions, and the conclusions are intrinsically tied together. The assumptions that we make will in many cases drive the conclusions that we come to. And so any transformation in Chris's life or our life, anything, will require a realignment of this belief system. Okay? And I just want to point out a point of entry into Chris's world, and we're going to talk more about points of entry in a moment. And that is that even though we are a very technically advanced, scientifically advanced culture, even though there is literally an app for all of life, there is this increased, and I think it's generally widely accepted, it's not hard to prove, sense that we are an increasingly suspicious, distrustful, violent, fearful people, right? And Greater Good at Berkeley did an article where they went through and looked at America's trust level, the way in which we trust our institutions, we trust ourselves, we trust our people group, and a steady decline. Why in the midst of all this good stuff, all this societal evolution, do we have these problems? Why are there people just randomly killing people in schools? Right? What is going on here? What's happening to us? Is it really as good as we think it is? Are we really evolving the way we think we're evolving? It's just a question for Chris. If you go to the next chart, I also want to really flip stomp this. Chris's world is full of words with implied definitions and meanings that may not mean the same thing and probably don't mean the same thing as they do to you and I. Okay? And I've given a couple of examples. Faith. Let's take faith in Chris's world. Faith in Chris's world probably means pixie dust and fairy tales, hope and a prayer, just kind of totally devoid of reason or rationality, no thought process, just that's what my dad told me, so that's what I think, and there's no evidence behind it. It's just something that's just totally divorced from quote-unquote reality. Faith to us means something very different. Chase pointed out in the children's sermon a couple of months ago that if you want to use a synonym for faith, use the word trust. Ask Chris to take faith out and put trust in. Think about the difference between what those words mean to you. Trust. Oh, yeah, trust. We trust. We all trust. We trust based on something. We have to make an assessment on what the basis of our trust is, but we all trust. Okay? Very different in Chris's world from maybe what you and I might think about in terms of faith. Love, hate, tolerance, fear. In this whole hoo-ha that we just recently had over on the homosexual front, there was a quote that was going around by Rick Warren, which I think is worth writing first is if you disagree with someone's lifestyle, you must fear or hate them. The second is that to love someone means you agree with everything they believe or do. Okay, and he goes on. But hear what he said, because I think it's important. If you disagree with someone in Chris's world, you fear it or you hate it. Hate means I disagree, or disagreement means hate. Okay? We would not think that. We wouldn't think I hate Hannah because I disagree with Hannah on some point. Okay? But the word play that is used in the culture in Chris's world is very connected. Love means total agreement. Okay? Not acceptance, but agreement. We must agree. Who are you, Mike, to say your opinion is better than mine? Okay, you like vanilla, I like chocolate, you like Clemson, I like whoever, right? Right? I mean, so we must agree. If I really like Mike or I really love Mike, we have to agree on everything. Okay, or I must accept his opinion about everything. I don't have a right to say differently. And that would be very different, obviously, than the way in which we use the word love, or hate, or fear. Okay. Do you fear something because you disagree with it? We would say no. But if you think about the word even homophobia, right? What does that mean? Fear of homosexuality. I don't fear it, to oppose it. So words, the definitions that we bring to the dialogue with Chris are very important. Not just using the same words and assuming that it's going to mean the same thing to Chris as it does to us. Now let's talk about truth for a minute. And just very quickly. On the chart, you see the historic view of truth, that which conforms to fact or reality in terms of God, whose very nature is truth. If you ask any Christian philosopher, that's generally what they're going to tell you. Okay, it's what's real, and it ties to God because God ultimately creates all things and God is true. Chris's world, and there's a whole, you could spend a lot of time on epistemology, many of you probably have, but basically it comes down to a Kantian and following view, which is that truth is objectively unknowable. Even if there is such a thing as an objective truth set, we're not talking about mathematics like 2 + 2 is 4. We're talking about moral truth. We're talking about what the oughts of life. It's too uncertain to know because of the very content of knowledge. Because we, as viewers of truth, are always going to arrive at different conclusions based on our knowledge set and based on our position. And therefore, it's relative. And we use the term relative. There is no, quote, absolute truth. You hear this all the time. Chris's world is a view of relative truth, and we've already touched on it. So, knowledge, for example, and proof, again, many competing views about what knowledge is. How do you really know something is what it is? But Chris's world, in my opinion, tends to view knowledge and proof very empirically. If you study philosophy and you know what empiricism is, you know what positivism is, which is a step forward, it's basically only that which can be demonstrated by experience and scientifically. It can be proven as a physical component to it. I can touch it, I can feel it, I can taste it, I can smell it, I can see it, I can hear it, I can measure it. Okay, the physical universe. That's proof. So when somebody says God cannot be proven, the underlying truth assumption that they're making is that he can't be proven in a physical construct, right? Well, we would naturally say, like some have said, it's kind of like if you lose your keys in the parking lot. You know, picture going off to college and there's a parking lot, some of it's lit and some of it's very dark, and you sit around and you look just for the light shining because that's where the light's shining. You might not find your keys, right? But it doesn't mean they're not there. The issue is that depending on how you come to the conclusion of what proof is and how we arrive at what proof is, will in many ways force the end conclusion. If I believe, as Richard Dawkins does, that proof of God must come from scientific evidence, that's going to be pretty hard for me to be able to put, God dimension which is not physical. All right? Well, the way I define it is pretty much going to give me the conclusions that I'm going to arrive at. So many times when we run, we run scared when we hear, you can't prove God. The question is, how do you define proof? How do you know that what you think you know, you truly know? What basis is that? And we're going to talk more about that in lesson 3. Last chart, our mission to Chris. Our mission to Chris is to show that the truth of the Christian gospel is necessary for his view of life to make sense. Let me give you a very quick illustration that Tim Keller does in the City Church. Keller, in talking about contextualizing the gospel, the context, not compromising, but contextualizing the gospel in the context of society and the worldview, talks about how because we are creatures in the image of God, Romans 1:18, running out of time, I was going to read it. The law of God is written in our heart, and there are elements of the law of God which are good things which we exalt as a society. We do exalt freedom rather than slavery. We do exalt rights within bounds. We do look for the day in which evil is past. We don't like to see pain. We don't want to see torture. We do believe in love. Okay, these are what Keller would call A-level doctrines or A-truths. A doctrines. They're things that Chris agrees. There are things that we agree. Okay. Let me give you an example, just leading into next week. Chris and we would agree that we hate to see pain. We hate to see suffering. We hate to see death. We hate to see evil. We would agree on that. Okay? We would agree that we believe that there ought to be a God, that there is a God of love. Chris believes there is a God of love. We believe that God is a God of love. But then Keller goes on to say, but there are other doctrines, he calls them B-level doctrines, which our society will not accept. They're, nasty stuff that you Christians believe in. How can you believe that? And he goes on to give an illustration from C.S. Lewis's about God being a loving God and a God of justice or wrath. And I'll close with this. Basically, the summary is, think about it for a minute, folks. You believe in a loving God? We believe in a loving God. But you say, that loving God can't be angry. He can't get angry. He can't punish. He can't be wrathful. That's bad. You say it's bad. And you Christians who believe in that judgmental God, how can you believe that? He said, think about what you're saying. If you really love someone, let's take a child, as most people can relate, a young child. And your young child is playing out on the street. And some, I'll be blunt, sex deviant comes and tries to take your child, to violate your child. You're not going to sit there in a kind of grandfatherly way and say, Ollie, I really wish that you would have taken my child. That's not kind. You're going to sit back, right? You're going to be angry about the violation that has happened to your child, your creation. You're going to respond with wrath. You said, think about it. How can you have true love and not have wrath? How can you have true love and not have anger? You're talking about a love that just basically is dismissive of all kinds of things that may happen. You have to have B in order to have A. And what we're going to try to do in the dialogue with Chris, and I'm going to try to set it up this way, is always to talk about A-level doctrines. There are things that on that list that we talk about, we absolutely agree with Chris. We would find conformity with Chris because he is an image bearer, because she is an image bearer, because we are. But there's going to be things that Chris is going to say, how in the world do you believe that? And what we're going to try to do is show that, Chris, if you really believe in the most consistent system of understanding and belief is to believe B2. I know it doesn't seem right to you, but think about it. It shows that, Chris, that apart from the Christian gospel, his or her views do not really hold together. They sound good. It's what we believed because we're the fish swimming around in water all our lives, right? And so our mission is ultimately, and it's not to win arguments. There's no series of argumentation that wins Chris, every time debate, get it. It's to bear witness, as John says, to bear witness in the light, so that through us, through John the Baptist, through us, everyone will be believed. That's the mission. It's the gospel. It's the gospel contextualized to Chris's world. Not compromised, contextualized. Put in the context of the words and the understanding, the views and the value systems which Chris understands, which Paul did, which the apostles did, which Jesus did, in order to be able to make the gospel, if you will, understandable and relatable to the world of Chris lives. So I went over, I'm sorry, by 5 minutes. But let's stop here and use the remaining time for the Q&A. And Rick, maybe we can try to pass the mic around.